Welcome back to Scaling Theory. Today's guest is David Krakauer, an American evolutionary biologist, the president and William Miller Professor of Complex Systems at the Santa Fe Institute. As you will hear in today's episode, David's research centers around a series of fundamental questions, such as: how did life and intelligence evolve in the universe? How do ideas evolve? And how do they encode natural and cultural life? In this conversation, David and I explore the evolving landscape of complexity science. We discuss its fundamental theories, emerging patterns, and intersections with AI and machine learning. We delve into the paradigm shift complexity science represents, its most significant contributions across disciplines, and how computational advances are reshaping its trajectory. We also talk about AI's potential to scale towards AGI through a complexity lens, the limits imposed by evolutionary principles, and what it means for artificial systems. Finally, as president of the Santa Fe Institute, David explores SFI's unique interdisciplinary model. I hope you enjoy the conversation. David, welcome on the podcast. I am incredibly delighted to have this conversation with you today. What I've done for the purpose of making the conversation as accessible as possible is that I have divided my questions into three different parts. First, I want to talk about complexity science as a field. Then I want to talk about complexity and AI because your work, I think, is highly relevant to the field. And then I can't help but to ask questions about the Santa Fe Institute, given your position and your knowledge of the field and your vision for what complexity can achieve. So with that in mind, let's start with part one of the conversation. So again, looking at complexity science as a field. My first question has to be about the 4 volumes entitled Foundational Papers in Complexity Science that you just edited. Now, they are all published. I must confess that I only received the first 2, so I didn't have a look at number 3 and 4, but it's coming. Now, if you take a step back, what strikes you as emerging patterns across all of these publications that, again, are the core papers in making complexity science a field or maybe a paradigm? We'll come back to that. So what are those emerging patterns that you've identified?
Over the years, many of us have asked this question: what is complexity? What is complexity science? Is it a discipline? Is it like biology and physics? Is it something else? Is it more like mathematics that unifies the sciences? Those are difficult questions to answer. And I decided at that point just to ask colleagues, researchers who had identified with complexity, what for you is the absolutely canonical paper that you would insist everyone that you corresponded with, all of your students, your colleagues, must read? Over the course of a few years, I started amassing that list of, you have to read this paper, you have to read this paper. Having amassed that list of papers, which was just shy of 100 papers, spanning 100 years, starting at the beginning of the 20th century, I asked each of these champions to write a history of that paper, its inception, its implications, its consequences. And so this 4 volumes is essentially a record of what the field, the practitioners, believe complexity to be, as opposed to asking them for a definition, which I find very unreliable. Definitions are always so dilute. So that's what it is. It is the first, I think, intellectual history of complexity, as expansive as it is, with these annotations. So out of that, certain patterns do emerge. But essentially, as I've said many times, complexity science basically is a science of machines, but a very, very expansive conception of machines. Not just classical machines like clocks and steam engines, but statistical machines, like bodies and brains and societies, that started to emerge as a field in the 19th century when 4 fields started to integrate. The study of statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, evolutionary dynamics, dynamical systems, and the theory of logic and computation. So that happened in the 19th. 20th is them coalescing. So in the 1920s and 30s, people started making connections across these domains, all of which were trying to understand purposeful matter, not the matter that physicists study of the sun and the moon and the earth, but the matter that we were making, machines, and the matter that we were observing in the natural world that had evolved. And the Cambrian radiation, the explosion in complexity science, really is the 1940s and 50s. And that's everything everyone knows. This is cybernetics, Norbert Wiener. This is Shannon's information theory. This is Turing's work in computation. This is Nash's work on game theory. In the 40s and 50s, many of the foundational fields come together. In the 1960s, computation is starting to be democratized, moving out of federal research labs into universities. This is the invention of Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP-1, IBM Model 360, the Olivetti 101, the Atlas in Manchester. These are computers now in university, and this is the era of computational experiment. Out of that comes cellular automata, Lorenz's work on chaos, many things that we're familiar with, Cobham's work on computational complexity, David Rauch's work on morphospaces, the shape of the biological world, all permitted by computation. So that's the 60s. In the 1970s, we've got over our infatuation with the computer to some extent, and we're asking, what is the architecture of the complex world? What are the underlying patterns, states of order? And hence, concepts like emergence become very important in the 70s. And this is, of course, the work of people like Phil Anderson, the extension of the study of chaos into the natural world with the work of Bob May in 1973 and others. In the 1980s, we start looking for universality, patterns that transcend their particular material implementation. So you're familiar with the work of, say, Stephen Wolfram, who'll say, well, there are underlying universal rules, pair back, self-organized criticality, Prigogne's idea of dissipative structure. So it's very much like physics again. It's like the new physics. And then in the 1990s, it's the empirical revolution. And for many people, that's the era that they associate with SFI. We were founded in 1984. You have Mitch Waldrop's book come out. You have Blake's book on chaos. It's network science, agent-based modeling, scaling theory, computational neuroscience, all of these fields that take all of those tools that were developed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and apply them to data sets. Underlying it all is the study of many body systems, collectives of agents who communicate to achieve a function. That is the underlying commonality in all of this work. And it can be neurons, it can be species, it can be actors in an economy. And all of those decades I've described were some effort to discern the fundamental principles that hold in all those cases.
Now, can we say what are the temporal patterns about the 2000s and the 2010s? Or is it too early?
Too early. It's too early. It's very interesting because I, in these 4 volumes, decided to put a hard stop at 2000 for several reasons, partly personal, because I thought my colleagues might kill me if I didn't include them, right? Because who's to say what is foundational when it is a matter of contemporary contribution? So part of it, I don't think there's enough time, to be honest, that has elapsed. I think that the empirical revolution continues. I think that's really very important because, as you know, The quality of the data is so much better now than it was in the 90s, for all sorts of reasons we might discuss. So they continue. We'll get there in a second or in a minute when we start confronting machine learning and new progress in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. There are currently computational transformations underway, as well as really important theoretical ones that continue to engage with better and better data. But I don't think I couldn't do that decadal summary yet.
Yeah. All right. So maybe a fifth volume will be published
By someone else, not by me.
But going back to those 4 volumes, you wrote a substantial introduction that is also published as a standalone book, in which you write that complexity is a paradigm and not simply a tool or not just a method or field. Can you explain the theoretical and practical importance of recognizing complexity as a paradigm, indeed?
Yeah. This is a very interesting philosophical question of the boundaries of our structures of knowledge. In the 1960s, the philosopher of science, historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, started to investigate a kind of evolutionary epistemology, which was very Darwinian questions about knowledge. Where does knowledge originate? How does knowledge speciate? How does it evolve? And when does it go extinct? And he substituted his own concepts for those ideas that were very Darwinian. He called the species of knowledge a paradigm and the extinction a scientific revolution, and the persistence of a species normal science in his scheme. And people have asked since then, are these paradigms real? In the 2000s, Thomas Kuhn introduced what he called the disciplinary matrix, which I find very useful an idea, which is in some sense a paradigm constituted by a set of compatible beliefs or theories or models, if you like, and observations. It's quite a complicated ecology of ideas and facts. And occasionally a fact is anomalous or a theory is incompatible with what is already there. And that threatens the integrity of the underlying network. That he called a paradigm shift when it couldn't accommodate the new fact or the new theory. And we've seen that throughout the history, most prominently in physics, which is what he focused on. And my view is that complexity is a paradigm because the standard models of physics and chemistry and biology, and I refer to natural history really in that sense, we had to put purpose, function at the core of our physical theories in complexity, which is incompatible with the standard physical account based on symmetries, principles of least action. And we had to do it in such a way that it wasn't religious, right? In other words, purpose in the natural world and the complex world is not, as far as I'm concerned, coming from some all-powerful deity. It's some property of organized matter. And so for me, the revolution of complexity was taking physical and chemical theory and putting agency into it to make it teleonomic or purposeful. And all of the new kinds of methods and techniques that had to be constructed to truly respect that fact, not least agency and reflexivity once the system becomes self-aware and changes its behavior in response to a perturbation or an input, makes complexity extremely difficult. As you know, in law or the economy, the problem is every intervention you make leads to an adaptive response by the system, which renders your input irrelevant. So we needed a whole new set of theories, and I think that paradigm of purposeful matter, unlike physics and chemistry, very much like economics and the law, biology, and sociology and so forth, but those fields weren't really based on a search for fundamental principles in the way that physics had. And hence complexity as a natural science even though it has enormous implications. In fact, it might even become a social science dominantly at some point. There are trends in that direction.
If we try to measure the importance of this paradigm on the fields such as law, economics, biology, physics, where do you think that complexity science has contributed the most so far? And where do you think it will contribute the most in, let's say, the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because complexity science is both disruptive with respect to the existing disciplines because it questions their epistemic status, but it's also enriching of the existing disciplines. So it has a very interesting relationship, I think. Clearly, one of the fields where it had a very significant impact was in economics. Economics, as you know, was essentially an equilibrium discipline with unrealistic assumptions being made about the computational power of the agent. And this was, of course, radically challenged by complexity economics. Hence, networks and agent-based modeling and all of these frameworks that challenged certain naive assumptions that make analysis possible. It's not that that was an entirely pointless assumption. It served a purpose, but that purpose at a certain point encumbered the field to the extent that it didn't allow it to engage with reality. So certainly that is a field. Ecology is another big field, clearly. All of the major theories of macroecology now come out of complexity-related science. The theory of allometric scaling, the so-called neutral theory, the theory of critical transitions, the maximum entropy theory of ecology. That's a field and it had already started to be modified in the 1970s, of course, by people like Bob May and others. Sociology and geography, significantly modified by network science. I mean, it's hard to imagine going into a geography or sociology department now and not at least one person standing up at some point during the day and talking about networks, information flows, and so forth. Neuroscience now is a circuit discipline. It's a network computational discipline. So within the fields, even within engineering now, the use of adaptive computation, genetic algorithms, genetic programming, and on and on. So I think they've all been infiltrated in some sense by this style of thinking. But of greater interest to me is how they're being subverted. And universities questioning whether the structures that they have inherited are the best structure, or maybe they should challenge that and create something a little bit more fluid, a little bit more like SFI.
On that, and this is where we see again that the divide between fields is clearly artificial, because, for instance, if I look at antitrust, which is a legal field, well, a lot of what we do is actually informed by economic theory. And a lot was informed by neoclassical economic theories, and a couple of us are trying to push for complexity economics to create a new foundation for antitrust. So this is where the divide is indeed clearly artificial. But now, moving on to a recent paper of yours entitled Unifying Complexity Science and Machine Learning that you published about 2 years ago, you explained that complexity and machine learning are complementary approaches. Now, conversations that I've had on the podcast already with complexity economists such as Doyne Farmer, Eric Beinhooker, and Michael Mobusa and others, all linked to SFI, often highlight how increases in computational power may enable them to do things that they couldn't have done just 5 years ago. And we have Brian Arthur's paper, Economics and Nouns and Verbs, published just a couple months ago, that echoes this sentiment very much. But if we leave aside those fields and here complexity economics and look at all fields, what is the main reason why machine learning will drive unprecedented progress in complexity science?
Well, that's an interesting question. Let's talk about that. Machine learning comes out of statistics, comes out of the analysis of data, and without mechanism. when I grew up, I'm sure it's true for you, we would always make a distinction between statistical models, which give low-dimensional descriptions of data, that's what a statistic is, but without necessarily having an understanding of where those patterns came from, as opposed to mechanistic explanations, which try to explain causal patterns by using certain fundamental principles, like the conservation of energy or what have you. This remains true to this day, and machine learning and neural nets are statistical science, not mechanistic science. And they've only become more and more powerful by having access to more and better data. So I would say that there are two paradigms that are coexisting at present in the complex domain. One is what I call the fine-grained paradigm of prediction. Models that absorb huge quantities of information and data, and they are able to make very impressive predictions out of sample, but for reasons that we don't understand. Perhaps we'll never understand, because they're so irreducibly adimensional. Then there are these, what I call coarse-grained paradigms of explanation, which we typically associate with complexity science, and which in some sense resembles traditional natural science in an effort to make the natural world or cultural world intelligible to you, so that you can causally intervene in a reliable way. It's very hard to causally intervene into a trillion variables. So that's where we are. And what I try to ask in that paper is, can we make a bridge between these two worlds? And that's already starting to happen, because serious neural net researchers, not the users of ChatGPT or Claude, but serious researchers in that field are trying to do a statistical mechanics of neural networks. What is the underlying causal source of order, like my colleague Brice Menard, who's at SFI, actually from Paris originally, and at Johns Hopkins. There are currently efforts afoot. And the open question for all of us is that effort ultimately futile? If it turned out in the end, if you think about disease, non-Mendelian disease, most diseases, in other words, that are inherited, let's say it is true that 10,000 different loci across your genome, positions in DNA across your genome, are important in a myriad different configurations. There isn't a 10-variable model. Those systems will never be intelligible. You might be able to predict. It's not clear we'll be able to intervene. And that's why, by the way, intelligibility and understanding matters. Because prediction is one thing, engineering is another, intervention is another. Right? So you as a lawyer, you said, I want to make a new law. And I said, you can't, because you have to make a law that intervenes on 10,000 processes. You'd say to me, David, I can't do that. And so then at that point, we have to sort of sit back and ask, are we wasting our time? Are we kidding ourselves? Or is there another way forward? And I think complexity science is an effort to find those emergent regularities in high-dimensional systems that allow for the possibility of practical intervention.
Yeah, indeed. So let's talk about that. You have a paper entitled The Debate Over Understanding in AI's Large Language Models, published in 2023, co-authored with Melanie Mitchell, in which you explore what it means to understand in a human sense and whether AI is capable of this. You have another paper entitled Transitions from Non-Living to Living Matter, 2004, where you note that all life forms are made up of non-living molecules that somehow aggregate into living entities, which is something I never considered, but after reading the paper, I'm like, well, obviously. Now, few people's perspective on artificial general intelligence, AGI, interests me as much as yours. Considering these articles and other research of yours, what are the strongest arguments for or against current AI scaling to the level of AGI?
I mean, this is now very much in my core interest area, which is intelligence and stupidity, by the way. And it's important to note that AGI is not a word that we ever used for humans. This is a word that started to be used for neural nets and artificial intelligences. So I don't think it's a real thing. That's the first thing I would like to say. Because it's used almost as if humans are calibrating AGI in machines, even though AGI was never a human property. And so that I find a bit paradoxical. However, it is true that humans are general learning systems, right? You can learn the violin, you can learn topology, you can learn Provençal poetry.
But I cannot learn Dutch. I've tried very hard.
Well, we'll get to the limits of learning in a second, right? You can't learn how to be a fork. You can't learn how to be a piano, right? So that it's a very interesting issue. What are the boundaries and how can we understand them in terms of theories? And so essentially, human intelligence consists in the acquisition of skill and expertise in domains that at some level seem to be orthogonal, unrelated, right? I mean, you could be a great chess player and a mathematical buffoon, and in fact, many are, and so on. You could be a great politician and a terrible economist, and of course, many are, and we see it all the time. So when we talk about AGI, we have to be very careful. What we're really talking about is the ability to acquire a large set of skills and expertise. You know, I remember my friend Ray Monk, who is Wittgenstein's biographer, telling me about a letter that Einstein received where he was asked, look, you're such a brilliant man. You won the Nobel Prize in Physics. Surely you can solve the world's economic and political problems. And we view that as a naive request, but it's a kind of AGI point that's being made there. And I've heard very prominent names who I won't mention make very similar stupid requests about ChatGPT. They'll say, oh, let's just ask it how to solve the world's political problems the way that Einstein was asked to solve the world's political problems. Now, with respect to your earlier question of non-living parts making living wholes, that's a question of emergence. And in fact, Melanie Mitchell, my brother, John Krakauer, and I are writing a paper now on emergence in LLMs. And I want to make an important distinction. Think about emergence in the natural world. If I asked you, give me an example, you'd say, I'll give you an example. I have an H2O molecule, and I put lots of them together and I make water, right? So this is a collective property. Or maybe you'll say, you know what I do is I take water and I turn down the temperature, make ice. Okay, you think, wow, difference in the phases of matter. But what you'll notice in those examples is you've only changed one variable. I've either changed the number of H2O molecules or I just changed the temperature. Right? These are sometimes called control parameters. And the whole history of emergence is finding very, very simple ways, low-dimensional interventions that change the aggregate macroscopic properties in a fundamental way, like the changes in the phases of matter. Now look at an LLM. I know you're interested in this because of the Darwinian demons paper. We put loads and loads of data in. We're not just changing the temperature, which is a global change in the system. We're individually fine-tuning every single component. That's what you do when you use reinforcement learning. It's a local optimization of a parameter. And it's very strange to talk about emergence in such a case, because we typically reserve emergence for surprising structure that comes from very economical changes in the inputs. This is a very non-economical change in the inputs that leads to a big change in the output. We don't have a concept of emergence for such systems. And this is a formal statement I'm making. And so when people give machine Turing tests and they say, wow, that just wrote Python code to make a web page, how extraordinary. There is no basis for making the extraordinary claim because we have no theory which tells us how much input a given output requires. So the theory of phase transition in physics was interesting precisely because there seemed to be a discrepancy between the input and the output. Whereas in this case, we don't know. So I think the whole discussion about emergence of intelligence LLMs is completely undisciplined and is not based on fundamental theory at all. And so to make these kinds of arguments, we need new theories. And I think, to be fair, thoughtful practitioners in the field, not the ones who are selling products to Microsoft and other companies that summarize your emails, which seems to me fun but not fundamental, those people are worrying about these topics as we speak.
And indeed, it seems that maybe not the general public, but non-experts such as governmental agencies are becoming aware of the fact that more data does not necessarily mean that the foundation model you come up with will be necessarily better in a linear way, which was kind of the talk in town about 5 years ago. But we see now that small models can actually compete with much larger models, and that the way by which you train the model also has importance, and we see technical advances. So it is clear that indeed that relationship between input and output is not clear, and it is demonstrated not to be clear. So maybe that's something on the positive side for all of those companies investing in the space, because they can always come up with a new way to use the data that they have. But now I want to focus on the limits of those systems. And here I want to plug another papers of yours, which I've been obsessed about. It is entitled Darwinian Demons, Evolutionary Complexity and Information Maximization, published in 2011. Now, in that paper, you introduce what you call demonic selection principle, stating that organisms cannot exceed the complexity of their selective environment. So essentially, organisms evolve to encode as much information about their environment as needed for survival, but they are bounded by the complexity of that environment. If we apply that to AI, knowing that AI is, yes, digital, but relies on our environment and the digital one, do you think that AI system will face a similar limit?
Definitely. I mean, this is a really important problem in the evolution of complexity, and an unsolved problem, I should say. And just to reiterate what you just said, what that paper shows mathematically for evolution and learning systems, it doesn't matter. Any system that trains another one through some form of reinforcement, natural selection or Pavlovian conditioning, doesn't matter. There's only so much information in the system. All the information in the system has to come from the world, basically. There can't be more information in the system than in the world. Now, there can be generalizations in the system that are not present in the world. Right? So the system can find a pattern that isn't self-evident in the world. How does it find a pattern? By being simpler than the world. And this is where your earlier remark about pruning models is so extraordinarily important. Intelligence is a statement about the limits of computation in the face of high-dimensional data. It is not a statement about unlimited computation, ever. If I give you a problem and you very elegantly solve it, very quickly, effortlessly, I would say you're smart. That's what being smart is. It's solving a problem without being in the library. Someone who has to go to the library to solve the problem, you don't typically think of as very clever. You think they're cheating. So those two remarks you make are actually conjoined. The demonic selection principle says that the information content of the system is always bounded by the information content of the world. And for the system to be intelligent, it has to be computationally constrained in order to discover generalizations. Because if you're not constrained, you overfit, you just describe everything you see. And this is something that's not sufficiently appreciated. And I think, again, the field is starting to discover that, as you just said. Giving them more computational power is not the answer. That won't create more intelligence. It'll create less. And so we have to rethink how we've thought about both natural and artificial intelligence to accommodate that fact. And the bigger question you're asking, which is perhaps why you're interested in that paper, is how do you transcend the bounds of the input? And that is an unknown. And I tried at the end of that paper to talk about new theories of niche construction, where the system starts creating the world in its own image. As my colleague Ted Chiang, the science fiction writer, often says, once the data in the world is dominated by contributions by the machines, at that point it's all over, because it will spiral down into a singularity of stupidity. I would say, for me at least, as a theorist, that is the big open question. How do I transcend the limitation of the input?
Are you trying to get to an answer? Is that where your personal research and your personal capacity is?
It's one of them. It's one of them. Yes. And interestingly, that question has taken me down this path of puzzles, trying to understand Rubik's cubes and the abacus and the Soma cube. And in very little laboratories of human ingenuity, can we explore this question? Where does novelty in thought truly come from when it doesn't come from the micro world that you inhabit? And I don't have an answer to that. I think it's genuinely a mystery at this point.
Now, I've spoken about the Santa Fe Institute, SFI, with most of my guests so far, so I thought it would be fitting as SFI president to dedicate part of our conversation to it. What is the most important question about SFI that you've rarely, if ever, get asked?
Yeah, I thought that's an interesting question, because I think I must have been asked every question about the Institute. I mean, people ask questions like, how is it possible something so small in the mountains, in such an isolated part of the world, has had such an oversized impact? And that's very nice, and so on and so on. So how is it funded? That sort of question. The question for me is, why do very smart people all over the world at very good universities choose to come here? It's a little bit like asking, when you go on holiday, why do you go to Florence, or Hawaii, or whatever you prefer to go? And it's more like that kind of question. And I think the answer is actually simple, because SFI, the most important currency is freedom. SFI provides intellectual freedom in an environment that's supportive of novelty. And most places do not. They don't respect freedom. I mean, I think it's a weird thing to say, and I'm talking to a lawyer, so you know a lot about this, but we're constantly encumbering people with responsibilities, duties, which somehow make sense in some local institutional context, but which diminish your ability to reason. People come here because it feels like they have more oxygen in their brain. And of course, in a context which is devoted to the search for these principles. In other words, that matters. But for me, I'm always most flattered and gratified when someone tells me how much they enjoyed thinking a thought that they had not been allowed or able to think within the strictures of their home institutions. For various reasons that you alluded to. Oh, that's not what we do in a law school. Or that doesn't sound like a neuroscience question. Or that has been discredited, that idea. All these kinds of ways that we diminish the pursuit of the novel. And I don't want to do that. I want to allow to nurture embryonic ideas, even if they might turn out to be a bit foolish.
And it seems, but correct me if I'm wrong, that one way to enable that freedom is the absence of departments at SFI.
Yeah.
And even the architecture of the building is designed in a way to encourage collaboration amongst researchers. Can you tell more about this structure of SFI, both institutional, the absence of departments, and physical? And I guess I'm curious to hear if you have a couple examples where surprising fields came together under SFI roof because the people went to the kitchen at the same time and started to have a discussion when, well, from looking at that from a university perspective, it would have seemed to be very unlikely.
So let's just talk a little bit about the institute. So it has, you know, on the order of 150 faculty, but those faculty are spread all over the world, and they're a network, and that network fissions and fusions, right? In other words, people come together physically at the campus and then disperse to their respective institution. The number of people who are permanently resident is quite small, actually. At any given time, depending on the season, we can have 100 to 200 people in place. We have 2 campuses, not 1, 2 campuses. That's one point, that we've always believed in this network structure, in this sort of decentralized faculty, coupled to a beautiful physical location, right? There are no departments at SFI. There are no deans at SFI. There's no provost at SFI. All of that bureaucracy doesn't exist. And people will say, we need it for scale. That's a longer conversation. I think that's often not true. We have no groups at SFI. You are not allowed to have a group. So this is how universities operate, right? As you become more successful, you have lots of grad students, you have postdocs, you have lab equipment, you get more grant. We don't allow it. To the extent there's a group, it's a collaborative project between researchers, among peers, ideally. And the structure, the architecture reflects this. You have an office, and that's it. And then there's lots of open space. And as you pointed out, every day we have lunches communally. Of course, they're free. We have tea communally, of course, that's free. We support the social intellectual glue that allow people to come together. And because the money at SFI is not soft money, you don't have to be writing grants all the time. I find grants a wonderful disciplined means of exploring your field, but they shouldn't be considered essential to your economic viability. So we take that off the table. So if you come here and say, I just want to think and write one paper in 5 years, that's absolutely fine with me. A lot of the reward structures that we've built don't support freedom as we see it. So yes, I think the structure of the network, the structure of the architecture, and the culture align to create an environment for the free exploration of rigorous ideas.
Now, on that idea of freedom, and to relate back to what we discussed, where we see that complexity as a paradigm has been more impactful in biology and physics and economics than what it has been in legal studies, to my regrets, obviously. How is SFI positioning itself considering these dynamics? Is SFI moving in a direction to diversify the fields of expertise as much as possible? And you mentioned that, well, who knows? Complexity science may become social science because that's one direction. Or is SFI strategically focusing on specific areas where you'd say, well, we're going to do physics for the most part because this is where we think we can contribute the most?
Well, let me combine that question with the tail end of your earlier one. Surprising collaborations that have come out of the structure that point towards possible futures. So let me give you an example. I mentioned that we've always had novelists at SFI, for example. Most prominent in Cormac McCarthy, the playwright Sam Shepard and Neil Stevenson and others. And, you know, one meeting that we had was a collaboration among some of our Miller Fellows, one who'd won the Nobel Prize in The Discovery of the Ribosome, and another who is an author, a quite celebrated contemporary author in the English language. They came together to run a meeting on immortality. And immortality in literature, in culture, in myth, in life. And that's extremely interesting. It was very exploratory. We had musicians present and so on, all very seriously engaging with this question of what establishes the lifespan. That was one of a meeting that I found interesting that way. Let me give you another one. A prominent historian of the Roman Empire, Karl Harper, whilst at SFI, got interested in not only the energetics of human history, which is something that Jared Diamond had focused on in Guns, Germs, and Steel, but the computation in human history. And he teamed up with David Wolpert, one of our resident faculty who works on thermodynamics of computation. And now they're writing a whole new series of tracts on the thermodynamics of history, the thermodynamics of computation in history. Very strange, really interesting. Who knows where that will go? Many of our faculty have joint appointments. One of our faculty, Mark and Adele, has an appointment both in physics and music. So we've been now more and more interested in the structure of musical composition through the lens of physics and network theory. Some of these meetings are interesting and don't go anywhere. Some of them are very generative and slowly evolve. So when you ask this question about the future of SFI, first of all, I'm an emergence thinker. So I don't believe in being prescriptive about the future of a place like SFI. It has to come out of to use a sort of slightly shop-worn phrase, a bottom-up emergent process of free inquiry. I think that is true, though. I think I would stand by that. If someone like me were to impose structure on the Institute, this would be very stupid. I mean, this is not a good way of using collective intelligence, using one person's intelligence. That's what I don't like about universities. I feel they're not using their collective intelligence as effectively as they might, because there's a little bit too much emphasis placed on bureaucratic positions at more senior positions, which I don't particularly sympathize with. On the other hand, we are now undergoing a major transition in the structure of the planet, geochemically and politically and economically. And the volatility is a bit obvious to everybody. I hardly need to tell you. I mean, just look at the world today. And so there's a sense in which many of us believe we should be engaging in a very neutral, constructive way. For example, providing better tools for dealing with the current situation. I don't presume to know what the best configuration is of anything, but I do know that if you're using methods that are out of date, that make naive assumptions, that are at odds with what we know about the human mind, they should be replaced. And I think that was what complexity economics and other fields were motivated by, right? In other words, this is absurd. I mean, we should incorporate greater realism. So I don't think we can ignore the situation of the planet, but I would like to be able to make a contribution that was not partisan and that everyone saw as being valuable. Because I sort of want to believe in the end that most human beings are good and care about the future, but they don't necessarily know how to do it. But that's somehow a new emphasis for all of us that's become more existentially pressing in the last decade.
To conclude on a poetic note, maybe, you've mentioned that novelists have always been part of the SFI family structure. What do they bring? What do you feel will be missing if they were not to be part of SFI?
You know, this is a whole really fascinating discussion about the arts and the sciences and the humanities and so on. And the way I see it is that in the early phases of projects, where the creative, exploratory character is dominant, the distinctions between the arts and the sciences are very diminished. As you scale up productivity and you start moving into a kind of manufacture mode, then they start to diverge because repeated experiment, issues of reliability, issues of marketing, and all of those issues start to become dominant. And at that point, the distinctions between all of us start to materialize. But early on, and given that SFI is a kind of perpetual startup culture in the space of the intellect, that we never scale anything up. As I said, there are no groups. If you have a group, you should leave. And that's what happens. Faculty leave to build groups elsewhere. Given that that's the case, then how the imagination works, how we elaborate counterfactual worlds, becomes the most important thing. And that's where we all learn from each other. And it's fascinating. If you sit down with one of I don't think you'd even know that they were not from your field, or because the kinds of questions that we tend to ask would be very shared. And so that's one part of it. And the other part of it, to be honest, is aesthetics. I believe that all worthwhile human endeavors are absolutely preoccupied with the concept of beauty. And we in our world's law and science, we kind of pretend that's not true. we inhibit that for reasons which are beyond me. And in the arts, fortunately, beauty is still ascendant and primary. And I think we would benefit enormously from re-engaging with aesthetics. And there's a wonderful Denis, a Navajo phrase from the Southwest, which is live in beauty. And I think that's true for everything that humans do at their best.
A big final question could have been whether there is objectivity in beauty. The obvious answer is, of course, no. It's all subjective. But I asked that very same question to the writer Bret Easton Ellis, who authored American Psycho. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what if I take your novel and I put it to Google Translate and I put it into French? Can't I just say that objectively this is worse? That's the original piece. And said, well, I think it is. So that will be a big one. But when it comes to the relationship between artists and science and the research of objectivity, maybe there is something there as well. That's unify.
You know, it's interesting. It makes me think of a slightly mischievous historical observation that one of my favorite writers, Jorge Luis Borges, read Don Quixote first in English. And when he went back to read Cervantes in the original, he said it was worse. So this is an interesting case where, at least according to him, the translation was better than the original. So that was fun.
That's very unique. On that, thank you so very much for the conversation, obviously, but also for everything you've been publishing, for your leadership, emergent leadership at SFI, and for all the inspiration throughout the years. It's been a true pleasure. And so on that note, to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the discourse.